Well, simply because we need to have an organic body before we can have a sensory motor body, and a sensory motor body before it can be a social linguistic body.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the one, that there is an order of ontological priority, to put it that way.
Right.
Because as soon as we have one, we start transforming the previous one, and so they're codependent, and so there is no ground level.
Great. Welcome, Ezequiel. So nice to have this opportunity to have this conversation with you. So often we're in our rooms, reading books that we get excited about and reading other books. And then you have this over excess of energy to try to have the conversation. And I feel very fortunate to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, I look forward.
Um, yeah, so we're going to focus mostly on two books of yours, Sensorimotor Bodies, and then we'll move on to Linguistic Bodies. And I thought what we would do is first, I would like to ask you two framing questions, because most of the people listening to this broadcast, they know something about cognitive science. They know something about 4E cognitive science. These are popular. So I'd like to frame that your work in terms of those kinds of phrases. And then I want to ask you a follow-up question. So the framing question is, I'll just read this very nice sentence you have, is you state, and let me just say this, is that when I say you, I know you wrote the books with colleagues. So I want to welcome the colleagues into this conversation too. So I know that's important to you. So you and your colleagues state a non-representational theory of action and perception establishes the deep continuity between life, mind, and then I think I put language. And so my first framing question is, the people that are working with representational models, predictive processing, computational models, what do they get wrong, or where do they go wrong? Because I know many of these people they will say they're embodied cognitive scientists, but how does it get mixed up in their work?
Yes. Well, that's a really good question, because it opens up a very rich landscape for discussion. First of all, there is a very traditional approach in cognitive science, which we might call the representational computational view of the mind, that says basically that to understand the mind scientifically, we need to understand how it functions as if it were a machine, and in particular something like a computer that is performing computations that could be for prediction or for regulation, for control, etc. And that is all underpinned by some kind of representational theory, where states of the mind, or state of the brain more specifically, stand in for state of affairs in the world. Now, that's very strong. It's a very strong way of looking at cognition. It has roots in Descartes, and even beyond Descartes. Sometimes we can trace it back, but when the embodied cognitive science starts to emerge at let's say, the 1980s, 1990s, as an alternative way of looking at cognition, it's not necessarily the case that the representational view is totally rejected by everyone. Although a major drive in many of the you know interesting novel aspects of embodied cognitions that were being underlined by this movement in the 90s they claim that we could do away with the representational approach. That in fact it was doing much more. It was more like of an obstacle, and that since our minds are embodied, we are always present with our bodies acting in the world, and that sort of like division where there is the world out there and the mind in here was problematic. That there was more of a transactional aspect, which essentially the body takes care of all the time. We are embodied, we are in situations, and so on and so forth. So that there was a rejection in some uh, in some circles of embodied cognition, but other circles of embodied cognition research, they thought that the body was important, and they could take several of the lessons of embodied cognitive science, but they could somehow bring it back together with a functionalist or representational approach to the mind, very much a mind that is extended, a mind that is embodied, but in theoretical terms, doing more or less the same as it was doing before, mediating its interactions with the world via a sort of picture taking or representation that is then manipulated internally. And that is the kind of approach that many colleagues and myself reject, some more vehemently than others. Some are champions of non-representational approaches to the mind. I myself I just simply reject it and try to explore what are the alternatives to that, what other stories can be told. And eventually it can all be said that maybe we need a plurality of stories, and we can see when which stories are helping us better understand cognition or whatever we want to understand. So that's a bit of the context. I mean, there is no contradiction necessarily with adopting an embodied perspective and still holding on to the original, more traditional frame of explanations, which is a frame that separates very much the cognizer on one side or the agent and the world on the other. And that is more than the representation itself. I think that's what I reject, that separation. There is a distinction, but there is always a transaction, a mutual constitution of the agent, the animal, the organism, the person, and their surroundings. And the idea is to try to see what new form of science, of cognitive science, can emerge from adopting this different perspective. I think you're muted.
Yeah, and I think that word science is very important because it's obvious you're trying to create also not only an approach, but a methodology that's rigorous and scientific. It's difficult because you're not a scientific reductionist. So, a reductive scientist is not going to see, oh, is that science? But
right.
I do see the rigor in the work. And also, you do say you're not what, anti-representationalist, because you believe in, and once we get into the linguistic body, it seems like a short jump between that and the representational mind, that you can cover all the distance, all the way up to the fact that we do have representational minds, we do have dualistic minds, we do have computational minds. And so what I see you saying is like, you can't just start with the kinds of minds we have today and say that goes all the way back. There's a more primordial nature of mind.
Yes.
That's
Yes.
situated in, yeah.
Indeed. The way I would put this is that there, among our many cognitive capabilities, we find the capacity to represent, to symbolize, and to perform forms of cognition that you might compare to some form of calculation or prediction and so on and so forth. These are things we do. And of course, these are things we need to explain. The idea is that there is a distinction between things we do and how things work, to put it a bit quickly.
Mhm.
How things work requires us to be very careful, not to very quickly transpose, the cognitive performance or whatever we're interested in into the processes that are involved
Mhm.
by just simply making a mimic of that
Right.
performance in the process, a sort of mimesis of what we do, as if, and that is very, unfortunately, is very prevalent in the language that is used in cognitive science, in neuroscience, in psychology sometimes, where we often talk about, for instance, the brain making predictions
Mhm.
or the brain perceiving. And now brains don't do any of that. The brains are organs of embodied agents. As agents, we perceive, we act, we talk, um, but uh, the whole, it's implied in that language that anything that needs to be explained about the cognitive performance,
Mhm.
it will all be found only within the brain.
Mhm.
And without wanting to say that the brain is not important, I want to say it's just a logical problem here, that we are missing the person, we're missing the whole organism and their relations to the environment as constitutive ingredients in
Yes.
any explanation of the mind.
Yes. I mean, I think that's an important and beautiful part of your work, is that every thought, in a sense, maybe poetically in many cases, but often cases when we need novel ideas or we need novel insights, every thought draws from the environment all the way through the body and then percolates up as a thought. And of course, we have all these shortcuts, right? We don't have to do that all the time. And but that holistic, that whole cycle is available to all of us all the time. And so the second framing question that is, I think, extremely important is, why does it matter? So for example, if we were a, a globe of people, a planet of people who really understood the deep continuity between life and mind and language. Language is the hard one for some people.
Mm.
How would that change? How would that change our predicament? And this is obviously in
Yeah.
in your imagination, but I really do think it matters at a certain level.
Well, from my perspective, it matters a lot, um, for different reasons. Um, One of the reasons is that we are inevitably influenced by what science tells us about ourselves, what we are told when we want to understand who we are and what is our place, and science has, of course, a series of answers, and many people will obviously look at with admiration and seriousness to what science has to say. But when science is telling us that essentially we are like machines, or or that our brains function like computers, or that we have no agency to speak of because science says very little about agency. Our view of ourselves gets, we may accept it or not, but we are being put in a certain double bind. If we take science seriously and we take our lived experience seriously, then it seems like it's almost as if our lived experience is not real. Our sense of what matters to us will be reduced to some neurons firing in the brain, and so on. So the the the, the possibility of an alternative approach that is, as you said, attempts to be rigorous and serious by starting from a different ground and start building up a serious um, body of work, um, it may actually be able to, reunite that sense that has been somehow alienated, that the sense of like we are biological machines or neurological machines, but at the same time we are people, we are persons, we care. Uh, and in the enactive approach, in the approach that I and many colleagues work on, we do have that vision that it's possible to tell a story that I wouldn't say is complete, but it's satisfactory, at least in that respect, of putting our own experience as living beings into the story in a way that fits. And so, and that in practice, it can be manifested as different implications. People that have adopted some enactive ideas are interested in therapy, in psychotherapy, in sports psychology, et cetera, because they put a more person-centered approach to their practice, and they welcome a theory that is also centered on the person, on the organism, and so on. So yeah, we could talk more about the different
Yeah.
possible differences that it can make. But overall, I think it's good with this service science that takes our experience as living beings seriously. And that's, as you say, at the beginning, it's a tension because science tends to be reductionistic.
Yeah.
You need an alternative to that.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get into, I think, when we go through some of your concepts, we'll also can reflect on why these things matter. But let's lay out the definitions of the three kinds of bodies that you work with. And I just want to throw out again a caveat, because this has happened to me. We're in casual conversation, it'll sound like they're stacked like stratified reality. But I know from, if you read all the care you put into your books, they're not, their relational properties aren't like from simpler, modular to more complex. But we can introduce them like that. And then let's talk about what are the relational properties, because if you try to do both at the same time, the language becomes so thick. And I just wanted to
It's
give
true.
you
It's very difficult.
yeah. So you have organic bodies, sensorimotor bodies, intersubjective bodies, and linguistic bodies. How do you like to lay out that progression?
Okay. So, as you say, the story has to be told in a progression. Otherwise, it's very hard
Yeah, we're going to do the
follow.
simple way first.
At the very beginning, we want to take seriously the fact that we are living beings, that we are organisms, and for that we rely on a tradition, we might say, of looking at organisms from an organizational point of view and how they are organized as processes and how they are individuated as processes. And so the organic body is this sense of the body that is constantly metabolizing, constantly producing itself materially. Our cells are being renewed, all our organs and systems are being regulated and constructed as we live, in complex relations to the environment and complex relations to other organisms. And that sense of self-individuation that the body is making itself out of the relations to the environment gives us a first notion of a term that we use a lot, which is autonomy. Now, autonomy should be understood here as a technical term. We will see how it may relate to other ideas of autonomy, but simply is the fact that or the way of describing that the system is organized in this way that it keeps producing itself under precarious conditions, is not guaranteed, and all these processes are related to each other in such a way that they help each other continue being and doing what they do. So that is, if you like, a level of regulation of our bodies is this organic level, and it has to do with you know, we need nutrients, we need air, we need rest, we need vitamins, and so on and so forth.
Right.
All of that is inescapable aspects of our body. Um, shall I move on to
Yeah,
the
and
others, or you want to
well,
ask?
and I know because your work is so holistic. So also what we're going to learn a lot about is this regulatory or normative function. So already, just as a living organism, not even
Indeed.
our bodies, a paramecium, single-celled organism,
Yes.
there is a normative function. The organism knows more of this, less of that, not this, not that. I mean, there is a regulatory thing, and this builds all the way up through as whole social value norms. And
Yeah.
so this is what's beautiful about your work. You have, and then I just highlight the other one, then maybe we move to sensorimotor. This notion of life makes itself out of the materiality of its environment.
Yeah.
And then you're going to say, we individuals make themselves out of others. There's always something about the pre-individuated background that we don't just metabolize, we are that informing itself in formation
Indeed.
or something. So yeah, so that's beautiful. And the ongoingness of it is regulated by some kind of normative functions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You put it very well. I think already you might think, okay, I've been talking about a body, an organic body. What does that have to do with cognition? But the point of taking this perspective on the body is that we can already say that to be alive is to engage the world in terms of what we call sense making, but essentially that's a very broad term for cognition.
Right.
Sometimes we use cognition more exclusively for higher level cognition, but the whole point is that even for bacteria, they are not indifferent to the possibilities and the consequences of their actions or the circumstances. They will follow a sugar gradient where there is in the direction where there is more sugar, not in the direction where there is less sugar. And that means that there is a co-definition between one aspect of the environment that we as observers might have thought. Imagine that you're looking at it very naively and say, like, why do they care about sugar? What is the point? And then you will realize upon further investigation that, oh, but look at how they're metabolizing the sugar and how they're using the sugar to, have webs of energy that exchanges and repairs
Yeah.
of the whole little body. So in a way, to be a body that is autonomous and precarious in this sense is already to be cognitive in very broad terms. And that is, as you say, as you just suggested already, is a story, a relation that will carry on as we go into more and more sophisticated forms of mind. Um, and it's also a story of how there isn't there isn't a single organism or an organism that is kind of dropped into the environment. The organism is actually being taking shape, being in
Yeah.
form out of the environment itself. Is being made out of the environment, literally. So, we are being made
Literally, and this is
yeah,
something we'll touch on later. It's the constant reminder of the materiality that's all the way through, which is not the
absolutely.
same as materialism. I was just thinking, this is an interesting question. You know how they show you these you can have these lipids that are biophilic at one end and the phobic at the other end, and th'll line up as membranes, right? But
Yeah,
they have no normative dimension. Like they don't, so they have this organization,
yeah,
and you could say it's precarious, but they do nothing to work against their own precarity, because if you
yes.
break them up, they just,
They just break.
they're
Yes.
just, so it's an interesting way to see this parameter between
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we may be getting into some technical aspects here, but it's important
Yeah.
to distinguish this concept of precarious autonomy from other concepts that are in the same family, so to speak, like the concept of self-organization, for instance. So you see that this biped, this bilayer gets organized, is self-organized, and that's
Hmm.
useful for life and so on.
Right.
But the idea is that um, in an organism, the constitutive processes depend on each other. This is a chemical reaction that just will happen
Hmm.
whenever you put the right conditions, and it just happens. Um, but in order for that to count as a process of the organism, for instance, the rest of the organism should try to help and guarantee those conditions, because otherwise in the medium in which they exist, maybe these proteins would just fly away.
Right.
So in a way, each element is helping each other, um, in a sense that it's not merely self-organizing. Not to say that organization is unimportant, but it is adaptive. It's adapting in the sense that is regulating its viability, the possibilities of continuing to be what it is,
Hmm.
in an active way. And that is where we kind of connect that to the idea of norms. The idea of
Right.
uh, if it is regulating, it's because it's following some norm, and the norms, the vital norm of maintain yourself alive, protect yourself from too much heat or chemical, poisons and so on. Those norms are grounded in this organization,
Hmm.
this autonomy of the organism.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to go into there. I'm just going to bookmark it because you and I could geek out on entropy
Yeah,
and et cetera. But let's go to, so the important thing is now we're going to go to sensory motor bodies, and you'll hear the same kind of template, the same kind of enactive template at a more sophisticated level. So
that's
what's a
right.
sensory motor body versus,
Well,
yeah.
the motivation for trying to understand these different forms of regulations or dimensions of embodiment comes from the fact that if what I said earlier is true, or we hold it to say, well, we believe in that and see what happens, that norms are grounded in forms of autonomy. How do we explain that we often care or regulate our interactions with the world in a way that doesn't seem to be so directly connected to our biology? That we like certain colors, or we prefer certain foods, where
Curiosity killed the cat.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So that it requires us to then say, if this story um, is useful, it should be useful to explain these other norms as well. Well, it turns out that the proposal in the Sensorimotor Life book that we put forward is the idea that the same story repeats itself at a level of the organization of our sensorimotor repertoire, at possibilities for actions, and the history that shapes our abilities, our ways of perceiving, our skills, and so on. Uh, and this history is in a way um, creating an organized autonomy at the sensory motor level. And the clearest case that I often think is the easier to understand is the case of habits.
Hmm.
Like a habit that is kind of sustains itself, it calls forth the situations in which it is reenacted.
Hmm.
Sometimes, well, we even don't want that. And that kind of speaks for is evidence of this idea that there is an autonomous process
Hmm.
wanting to continue to do something and influencing your life, your existence. And this is getting rid of bad habit is difficult. And habits can even go against the norms, the organic norms of a
Hmm.
healthy organism. So all of that tells us that at another level, something else is happening that takes a similar shape. It's essentially processes that start to sustain themselves, to start to regulate their viability, and they try to adapt in order to continue or sometimes evolve or change according to a history of interactions with the environment. And so the sensory motor dimension of regulation is precisely one that happens at that level.
Yeah.
And yeah, it does again bring on a set of norms that are not necessarily biological norms. And when we admire somebody, a dancer making a very elegant move, and we admire something that is not related directly to the viability that as organisms, but we are valuing something else. And what is it? Well, it is a mode of existence, the sensory motor mode of existence that we have, of connecting, of seeing, of perceiving. Um, and again, it is precarious, it's being made all the time from interactions with the world. There is no sensory motor engagement that doesn't involve the world. There's
Yeah.
nothing, I mean, I always have to do something with the world. I breathe because there is air that I can breathe. I want a glass of water. I need the material glass there, the water to be actually water and not something else. And so those engagements are constantly percolating into our environment and therefore also affecting our environment and
Yeah.
affecting others. I mean, this is another topic, but or another complication, but our environments are not just simply given, they're also lived environments that where we are living or where others have lived, and therefore we engage with that history
Yeah.
also.
I find the concept of precarity is really rich and generous because, you talk about the child learning how to pick up a bottle or a glass or something. This is quite difficult for a child, this kind of
Yeah.
a glass, right? But then eventually on an unconscious and totally embodied level, it doesn't work out the math, and the
No.
levers. There it becomes a habit because the schema is regulated by agreements. I mean, this language. But then what's interesting is it's like when we think of the organic body, we say, oh, it's precarious because the environment is hostile. But precarity is a feature and a necessity of life, because then what we do is we always then challenge ourselves to do something that starts out being precarious again. And we take
Yeah.
advantage of the old habits and try to move into more and more of these higher challenges.
Yeah.
And you even have this great story about how the child knows how to do this and knows how to do that. So maybe they keep doing that because it's easy. And then the mother, the caregiver, comes in and puts conflict and tension. Well, how about
Yeah.
this one? Why do you
Hmm.
and even that original experience is adding more conflict or adding more precarity, adding more of
Yeah.
that into the solution space. Yeah.
Indeed. Yes. Yes. I mean, the way I like to think about it is that our bodies being precarious, as you said, it's a feature in the sense that well, we think like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to deal with uncertainty and risks and so on, and if life was guaranteed to be okay, everything. Sure, we always aim towards conserving our viability as the people that we are and the ancients that we are. But the truth is that without that element of precarity or precariousness, the things wouldn't matter to us. We wouldn't care about anything.
Mhm.
Life would be meaningless, to put it very quickly, because and I'm not just saying this as I mean, you could arrive at this thought from different ways. You could say like, well, the fact that we have to deal with all these difficulties and complications in life is what makes life worth living. Yes, but I'm not saying it like this. I think that's true, but I'm not saying it like this. I'm saying it's scientifically, you would not care about those things that do not affect your viability. And
Mhm.
in order to care about something is because there's always a potential risk, a possibility out there that prompts you to regulate, to care, to be conscious, or to pay attention to a possibility that you want to avoid or a possibility that you want to move towards. Um, and without that, we would just simply sit on the spot and do nothing. That's how I see it.
We
Uh,
would be just those like those lipid membranes.
yeah,
Yeah,
we would just simply settle down in a sort of a tractor and stay there and do
no.
nothing. Um, So often, if you consider this from a perspective of dynamical systems, it's the difference between stability, the system just falls into an attractor and stays there, and something more like meta-stability. The system is not quite stable, but it's sort of like in a durable condition, but it may quickly be affected, by circumstances and move to another situation. And that is the situation that requires some cognitive vigilance, so to speak. You have to be aware that all those dangers that at least you know of, you know how to cope with them. Um, or avoid them. And so, yes, you said something else that I wanted to mention. Well, okay, maybe it will come up again. But essentially, the precariousness is at all levels of this dimensions of
Yeah.
embodiment is fundamental. Um, oh yes, the mother that uses also this disruptions, because yeah, there is, if you like, in habits there is a certain conservative trend of trying to, okay, let's stick to what we know and keep there and keep doing the same thing.
Right.
But it's interesting that in these studies of the first year of development in mother-infant interactions, they typically show this pattern that the mother acts in a disruptive way, not
Because
intentionally.
she gets bored, right? I mean, isn't that where
Maybe
it comes?
maybe
That's
that's
where it comes up from.
exactly. Yeah, she gets bored and so on. So the little infant is there, very focused on one toy, and at the beginning, the first couple of months, grasping something, touching it, taking it to the mouth. It's all converging sensory motor schemes. They're all doing very homogeneous. And that's where the mother says, well, what about this other toy? And this is provoking a little crisis, to put it a bit
Yeah, yeah.
dramatically, that now have to pay attention to different things. And this is, you're growing, therefore, a capability of, if you like, attention, moving your attention to other objects, the possibility of disconnecting all these very convergent sensory motor schemes so that then you can grab an object but look at another one, so that the looking and the grabbing are not so connected, and so on and so forth. And then that kind of, it opens up all the sensory motor repertoire. But at that point, the mother typically has the opposite intervention, which is that
Yes,
to
yes.
disperse, to distract it. Why don't you keep working? Instead of jumping from one thing to another, let's play with this one for a while.
Yeah.
And then what happens is that all these capabilities that you've been separating, like looking, touching, taking something to the mouth, they become like consolidated. You can then now control better the grasping movement, and only when you need to, you can shift your attention to some other object, or to the mother, and so on and so forth. So all of these interventions are somehow enriching the development, because you might think that if you're trying to remain viable, you will essentially try not to do anything.
Right,
But
right.
all the social dimension of development fundamentally expands these repertoires and this possibility of development, and this continues throughout life. It
Yeah.
doesn't never stop.
So these concepts get really interesting when we talk about the intersubjective bodies,
Mm.
right? The way we try to do things together, and there's tension, and you talk about the norms have to start to be co-created,
Mm.
and then the linguistic body and dialogue and stuff. So I'm glad we spent a lot of time on it, because they become the generative functions of these other kinds of bodies. So let's start with the intersubjective bodies.
Indeed, yes.
It's a
So,
beautiful chapter. I love that part.
yes. So so we have to recap the story. We are organisms and have this organic body, and then we have become sensory motor agents, and we have this sensory motor, habits or organizations of activities and so on and so forth. But as I already said in the previous example, is that I mean, at least humans, primates, and many social animals, they develop in a social context. And so these regulations happens with the regulations of other agents. And something that we proposed a while ago with my colleague Hannah de Jager was that this sense making that we are doing constantly when we're making sense of our circumstances, our viability, our norms, um, often, especially for humans, almost always involves the other sense makers, other agents. And in these interactions, these dynamics of interactions, they are not just simply an exchange, like we're exchanging packets of information. We're really influencing each other at all these levels, from somebody offers me a glass of beer or whatever, and they're going to be influencing my organic body because I socially accept it, and then therefore their presence is going to have an organic consequence for me, and a sensory motor one probably, and so these influences have to be theorized better, and we propose the idea of participatory sense making.
Mhm.
That is to say, when we are in some way uh, making sense together, but our acts of sense making are influenced by the others and influence the others.
Mhm.
And this can go from anything that is very, like a mild influence, like I just point your attention to something, and by it's in a gesture, and you just look instead of looking at the thing you were looking at. Now you're looking at where I'm pointing. It's an influence, it's an orientation, to something much, much more sophisticated, like, writing a book together, creating something together where the ideas are flowing all the time and there is no clear author of the ideas. It's all happening in the activity. And so we propose that social interactions have momentarily this form of autonomy,
Mhm.
they themselves, social interactions, want to keep going. And sometimes we live through that experience of social interactions that keep us engaged. And even when maybe individually we would like to maybe stop or maybe move on or something like
Mhm.
this. And our feeling of what we experience is often that, oh, maybe the other person keeps talking, like in phone conversations that go on and on and on, and everybody's saying goodbye for a long time and then bringing up a new subject at the very end. And that it may be that the other person is doing the same, is feeling the
Yeah.
same. That none of us is actually actively trying to continue, but the dynamics of the encounter is continuing.
Yeah.
And so there is an interesting, what we call a heteronomy to our autonomies as living bodies and sensory motor bodies. We have to cope with this social in between that's happening between us. And so this is that form of regulation is at the basis of this intersubjective dimension of embodiment,
Yeah.
because it's at the basis that intersubjective level of embodiment has many more aspects to it, such as, for instance, how do we look at each other, how we recognize each other, and so on and so forth, how we are in many ways influenced by how others regard us, how others look at us. So all of that, but at the very basis is this idea that in the normal social interaction, there's already a need to attend to attention that is transformative. It's the tension between me wanting to just be me, my own agent, and the social
Yeah.
dynamics uh, having a sort of influence on us. Not the other person. The other person may have an influence on us, but it's the new thing is that it's the social dynamics that is changing
Yeah.
both of us, or the many of us who are interacting. And that is, in the book Linguistic Bodies, that's where the idea of understanding language will begin from that point.
Yeah. So, in my work, I work with horses. So for people to get a sense of how much is going on before the representational level, it's really good to work with horses, because dogs and these other pets we have, they work a little bit, can be more influenced by language. Okay. So, because they're predatory animals and they have these mirror neurons. But so basically, so we talk about bodies in space. You walk in, you got in an intimate situation, there's a horse standing there and you're standing there. And actually, from the outside, there's nothing going on, but you realize there's a lot going on. We just have bodies in space. And then exactly what you're saying, there's this, and of course, it's easy because the horse is not overthinking. What does she think about me? All the overthinkings on your part. So it's easy to just realize that. And what I got from your work is, again, this repetition is not that now we are a dyad, it's kind of not like a synthesis up, it's a new individuation. So from the pre-individuated level, so it's like and you talk about how you can fall back into the individuals, but the individual is the pre-individuated ground of this new co-regulated body, really.
Absolutely.
Body, yeah.
Yeah. So first, on the horse example, which is great, because if you have a lot of experience, I don't, with horses, you learn to see these cues, these movements, or that are very significant, but that maybe somebody with not a lot of experience like myself would probably not notice. And these are like little dances that are happening, but many other animals do that too.
Yeah.
Uh, and that is what we call participatory sense making. It's the model that you should have in mind when we talk about participatory sense making is like a dance. Not to say that everything is reducible to dancing, but it's useful to think that we're feeling our ways into the situation. We we are understanding the other. In the traditional model, the other is opaque. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know what they're feeling, and I have to try to guess it, to predict it from cues, from gestures, and so on. But in what we are proposing, we're not totally opaque. In the fact that I'm being influenced by you, I feel the force of your interaction, your movement towards me, and that is truly you. And so I see that, or I feel that, or I hear that. And and so we do have a way of connecting. Of course, doesn't mean that the other is totally transparent either, but it's more ambiguous, and it's all being played out in that dance-like encounter. Um, and so, yeah, that is how is this a new form of embodiment, of dimension of embodiment? Well, because we live in again in this world where these norms are not just sensory motor now. They're not just organic and not just sensory motor, but we start to care about how we sustain these interactions, whether we find a way of harmonizing with the other what we want to achieve or not, whether our goals are in conflict, and how to work with that. So in a way, all these things that we care about because we are developing a form of autonomy, which is autonomy as social agents, as participants in interactions. Yeah. And
Yeah, and this is important because autonomy doesn't mean the Walden individual. And I
no.
think you use these terms ecologies of norms or normative ecologies of practice. So I give you another example because I want to get into what is difficult at the human level, like what is like a problem we have psychologically and socially. So I have, I also have a barn and I have pigeons, right? And I'm fortunate not to have a great pigeon problem. Like some of my friends have hundreds of pigeons in their barns because I
Mm,
live next to the state park and the hawks call the pigeons every once in a while. So I always have like 4 or 5 pigeons. But over time, I put a log in the water because the pigeons like to walk down. And if the water is dirty, like I'll notice I'm working around the barn and I'm like, oh, the pigeon water is dirty. And I realized that I didn't see it, that there's cues, like who's training who, and like there's this and there and if so I can tell like a beautiful story because it's kind of like your body gets extended, you have more cares, the information it's their information that's creating normative standards in me. And then same thing in gardening. If you garden for 30 years, it's the same thing. It's like, it's not hypothetical, where do I end and where to begin? There's this larger ecology, normative ecology, that is just percolating through the system.
mm,
And they feel like, just if I care, if I'm hungry, I eat. So it percolates through your body as these care cycles of care, like you described. And I think that,
yeah.
again, it's easier for me and maybe for many people in the natural environment with plants. And the question is like, what gets in the way when we get to be linguistic bodies, let's say.
Mm, mm.
But linguistic bodies are not necessarily representational yet in abstract, correct? No.
No,
Oh
I
yeah.
mean,
So yeah.
oh, okay. So, so we could come to that. But I wanted to just say with the examples of the garden and the pigeons is that yeah, when we work on that idea of participatory sense making, we work up, we put it in such general terms because we wanted to keep it the possibility of interspecies participation as being also part of participatory sense making. Of course, many examples that we have at hand are human interactions, but interspecies interaction are also can also give rise to this encounter and this dance where we are mutually and recurrent with recursion. We're moving back and forth into some form of encounter or dance with another species, including plants, of course.
Right. And
Uh,
I think the point is it's not trivial, right? So I guess this is why I liked your work so much, because it academically verifies like my experience with the animals or something. But it's not trivial because it's not like, oh, you have a Disney narrative in your story about working. It's not like you have this representational narrative story that you've downloaded into your mind, and that's why you care for the pigeons. It all happens very surreptitiously and
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. In many of these things I'm talking about do not necessarily involve any kind of high level cognition of I mean they can, I mean we can think about these things, we can talk about these things and so on, but often you just go into the garden and do what you're doing, or you go and interact with a horse or you observe the horse and it's just happening. And our the way that we grasp what we understand is because we are participants. It's not because we're not from the outside looking through a glass into a scene, but we are on the scene. We are there, and so our participation is is cognitive. Is telling us. It's telling
Mhm.
our bodies something. It's telling our bodies that the horse is a bit upset, or it's telling that something is wrong with the pigeons or the plants. And later on, in fact, when we come to
Right.
linguistic bodies, we can also reflect on that. We have other forms of cognitions that are more reflective, that we can start asking such questions.
And I think that's the true empirical nature of science, that of course, then there's empirical that comes from with hypotheses and theorizing experiments and stuff, but science starts in this primordial noticing of some kind of relationality that's happening, and then what is the nature of this relation is what science is asking. Why does the apple fall? Because the earth loves it or something, like what's the relationship?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I also like that a lot of science or interesting discoveries in science, they're also driven by some gut feeling, by instinct, by noticing something, and the explanations we have are not sufficient. But it's not like we have these premises and these deductions, and we propose this hypothesis, very orderly. That's often a reconstruction that comes after the fact, and it verifies, if you like, that it's still science and so on, of course. But often it's like the lived experience is at the center of many scientific insights, of ways of understanding science. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so linguistic bodies, what does that what territory is brought into? We have intersubject bodies, there's coordination of norms, there's a co-regulation happening. When we get to linguistic bodies, what's the move there?
Okay, the context of this, of course, if you like, coming back to one of the first questions, the framing questions, is that the embodied approaches to cognition are often, if you like, acknowledged as interesting, but at the same time saying, but you can never get from there to human level cognition. You can never get from all these dynamics and processes and organic processes to something like the works of Shakespeare. There is no path that doesn't involve going back to that representational mind. So what we wanted to do in linguistic bodies is to say, well, there is a path. There are ways in which we can theorize how we go from all these stories about action, about the interaction, participatory sense making, autonomy, blah, 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 up to something that we can start looking at more recognizably as language. Now, it's a complex story, but and the story is, if you like, what the book attempts to do, apart from setting the context and explaining why we do this, is to try to put this signposts that you go from, okay, we are in this situation, but this situation develops into this one, into that one, into that one, into that one. And at the very end, we have something like, dialogues, utterances, and so on and so forth. And then exploring the implications of that at the end of the book. So, at no point in this story, which is a very complex story, I can give you some some elements of it, but otherwise it would take a long time. At no point in this story do we invoke mental representations as the explanatory tool. We do indeed arrive at something that we might call representing, but it's a complex capability that we develop with language. But okay, so that is a little bit the context of linguistic bodies. Um, how do you go from this sensorimotor talk into, or even interaction, participatory sense-making talk into something like language? You can't, I mean, or at least we believe that you cannot just tell a story of cumulative capabilities. That is a very common approach, and it's very interesting too. I mean, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that doesn't give us the whole picture. The story of like, well, first we learn this capability, like, I don't know, shared attention, the capability of turn taking or whatever, and then you just pile them up, and at the very end you have something like. We think that language is transformative, and and many philosophers think that, and we kind of think that is the way to go, to understand that languages is a game changer. all the stuff that came before, all the organic and sensorimotor stuff, will be transformed once we start entering into this linguistic dimension.
Right.
So to do that, then you have to see how you have to follow it like the development of an embryo, so to speak. That's the metaphor I sometimes have. You see all those pictures that it gets more and more sophisticated and it's taking the shape of a body and you start recognizing all the arms and so on. So that is a little bit the story of the book. We start with the beginning, which is that situation of participatory sense making, where we are navigating this joint encounter without necessarily, we don't have language, we don't have anything. It's more like a dance. And then we have to learn that the situation itself is precarious. It's not given that the interaction will go well because we may come with all the best intentions, all of us, and still it doesn't work. Um, so we realize that there is this internal tension between what each of us wants to do or achieve, or the way they want to move or act, and this encounter, the dynamics of this encounter. So to navigate that more effectively, we propose that often we can choose better ways of doing it, like starting to develop common habits, a habit of uh, completing actions together so that we can know that we are on the same page, to put it very quickly. And this is what we call social acts. A social act is an act that you cannot complete yourself, like the act of giving a present. You give something to somebody, it can only be completed if the other person accepts it. Like just putting an object into somebody's hand
Right.
is not giving. The act of salutations and so on and so forth. And then we start proposing a story of how these new situations create their own tensions and how these new tensions can be resolved in newer, more sophisticated ways, how we can use these social acts become like standardized sometimes, like salutations, like handshake,
Mhm.
and so on. And so we have a repertoire of possibilities of regulating our interaction, but this repertoire also creates their own problems because how do we know how how to search for the right responses to our actions and so on? Well, we will use some of these gestures as regulatory acts that says, like the act of nodding to say yes, that's the way to do it, or
Yeah, and you find out that you can feel it break down if you go to, exotic cultures, let's say, where the
that's right.
same gesture is, I want to bring in, because I want you to continue the story, but I
Yeah,
realize that your concept of attunement does a lot of work here. Like, how do you know when it's coordinated? You have this sense of attunement, right? So at first you're
yeah,
like,
yeah.
oh, I always eat pasta this way and I feel good. It feels attuned to me. And then you bring your Italian mother-in-law over and she doesn't like it, and you can feel socially you're not attuned. So the regulatory, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. That is the whole um the spirit of the model is that at all levels, even when we're doing very complicated stuff, there is this tension of what you're attuned to in the sense that the things that you know how to do, the things you care about, the things that give you a sense of things are going well, and something that comes from the outside, another person who puts that into question or
Right.
either just by a look sometimes, and then it's like, oh, did I do something wrong? And that tension is always there, and the idea is that, well, if that tension doesn't get somehow resolved, well, we might have to live with it, or we might have to stop interacting if it is too serious. But if we somehow try to work it out together, what we do is we pass on to something more sophisticated. I mean, we can work things out sometimes by pure chance, but
Mm-hmm.
if we want to systematically work out a way to resolve a misunderstanding about, for instance, cultural differences on how you eat pasta, uh, normally you would try to engage outside the actual misunderstanding to say like, can we work out how what's going on? What is the problem? Or what makes you feel that this is not right? And so on and so forth. And eventually you regain, I mean, if you move forward, you synthesize a new form, a new knowledge. This is how your body is transformed by the others, because perhaps, I mean, you might choose, it's up to you, obviously, to say like, no, I prefer to eat pasta the way I always done it. Or you might think like, you might think like, oh, there's something to this, or maybe I look more sophisticated if I do it this way, and so on. And maybe
Right,
I find another way, and therefore an opportunity happens for some form of transformation.
right.
This is coming back to the idea that we are making ourselves from our environment. In this case, we are making ourselves as social bodies from our social interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
You know, there's this, you said it, you use this notion of the more you go up, the more you have to navigate down. I don't think you meant it this way, but when you were just performing that little skit about the pasta, what I realized is like when you're in a social milieu and your habits are the same, right? So you make pasta every day for your husband and you eat it and this and that. That your awareness is really quite shallow, right?
Hmm.
But then if, like in this hypothetical story, your mother-in-law comes over, and what I was realizing was the resolution of those things requires you to be more conscious of these deeper layers of yourself. Like
Yeah,
instead of just saying, okay, what's your recipe? If you just keep it at the symbolic level,
yeah,
then it doesn't get resolved. And it's kind of like when these easy shortcuts, language is kind of a shortcut in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
If it's, shared, then it's important to then rework or work with, again, now you got to go back
Yeah.
down to your intersubjective sensory motor body and your posture when you're talking and your whole,
Yeah.
yeah, these resources become important again.
Yes, that what you're describing is exactly this notion that these dimensions are not independent of each other, that in fact they're very much entangled. And if it was merely a question of saying, agreeing at the symbolic level, oh, this is how you do this, so this is how
Okay, I
you,
make
uh,
pasta when you're here like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, okay, fine, no problem. If it was merely that, it would mean that very much those levels are kind of disconnected. But the next time you just simply go into the kitchen, your habits will take control immediately, will take control. And then you have to say like, no, well, no, I was going to do it differently this time. And you have to stop yourself and you have to essentially transform yourself at all these levels. Very much like the infant and the mother who's been somehow the infant's taken out of the comfort zone of what they know and what they do, and they need to equilibrate, to adapt. And it's not a direct process that is simply uh, finished by accepting the right on the correct information. That this is something you can't just simply say, okay, I know this and this is fine, and from there it should be no problem. No, it's a process of adjustment, transformation, and the fact that we're doing this, I would say literally with every social interaction. Sometimes it's the problem is these adjustments are very minuscule, they're not very
Mm-hmm.
important, but or there are adjustments that kind of maybe confirm a way of being, and that's also, but it's also a way of reaffirming who we are and our personality and so on and so forth. That is happening all the time. This is not something that happens only with very obvious cases, like somebody directly puts you in a situation of conflict with what you want to
Right.
do. It happens all the time with at all levels. So yeah, that's why all these dimensions of embodiments we say that entangle. And this is an open question very much. We keep on investigating. I mean, how do they relate? And it's not a question of one has priority over the others, which is what you said at the beginning. It's not a question of like, well, simply because we need to have an organic body before we can have a sensory motor body, and a sensory motor body before it can be a social linguistic body.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the one, there is an order of ontological priority, to put it that way.
Right,
Because as soon as we have one, we start transforming the previous one, and so they're codependent. And so there is no ground level. Of course, there are enabling relations between these dimensions. Yes, of course. You have a serious accident that doesn't, it prevents you from, I don't know, yeah, moving your limbs, or you have to stay in bed for a long time convalescing, then that will have an influence on all the dimensions of embodiment.
right.
But the same can be said as somebody who has who lives through some deeply social trauma, and it will affect all the other dimensions of embodiment as
Yeah,
well. So all of them are going to be playing, I wouldn't say the role of being central, but all of them have, if you like, um, an equal presence in this existence that you're trying
mhm.
to integrate, which is yourself, your body, your surroundings, and so on. So
Yeah, we talked about this. I might as well bring up the point. We did talk about it when we met earlier, and that is, I think one of the reasons why people can get very deep into a theory of mind based on representational is because, just as you said, these bodies are like they have an ontogenetic relation. They come through each other, um, and um, and but once the organism is mature, there's a kind of modularity that can happen, right? So I can be so caught up in symbolic narrative that I'm addicted to something that's bad for my organic body, let's say. So
hmm,
we talked about modularity, like at a certain maturity, your body, you can have a heart transplant, and you
hmm,
said, but the rest of your body has trouble communicating with it from then on, right? You have to have immunosuppressants,
yes,
right?
well,
So
yes, indeed. Our bodies are not just, you know, homogeneous. I
right.
mean, they have structure, they have organization, and they are stable or metastable processes in our bodies and are like our organs, and so on. And our form of lives is both enabled by that stability and very
Mhm.
much also sustains that stability. There's a double way relation. We don't engage in activities that will suddenly break our organization, our structures. So, so there's no problem in the story I'm telling. There is no problem
Right.
in saying that we can make distinctions. We can look at an organ and try to understand that organ. The thing is that the organ the organ in itself is an abstraction, and it's the organ in the body that is what we want to understand. So there are two problems here. One is if we abstract and do not come back to the context, we will miss all those interactions that keep making that organ what it is. And we think that
Oh,
the
so
organ is
you're like, you're
not
saying the
precarious.
organ isn't functioning in the body has re-regulated itself to accept this part. That's not it.
Well,
The work, yeah, that's something like that, the switch.
well, I mean, in the case of an artificial organ, like a transplant, what what you've done there is very much provided, it is the technical object that has been provided with a functionality that very much enables the rest of the body to adapt to it. So it's not that it's a simply replacement without any change. That's where so many periods of adaptation, and with this kind of heart transplant, you cannot just go simply running the next day. So the body has to now learn to understand and live this technical object, which is not just
Mhm.
merely a function. I wanted also to say it has to be the right materials, it have to be the right, you know,
You have
entering
to
a
trick the body's immune system.
yes, and
Yeah,
and so the rest of the body has to adapt to it, and that's why you can never finally keep on replacing organs so until the end, until you
right.
have the body, because the whole success happens when you have the right engineering and the right procedures for the transplant, and when you have a body that can take that and say, okay, I will change in order to now work with this artificial heart.
Yeah,
But that does not fully um, replace the set of relations that were before. They now enter into a new set of relations such that all the levels of embodiment remain, let's say, viable, very likely change to what that viability has changed to what it was before, but you can continue your existence.
yeah,
So you incorporate in something external, and you're making it part of your body in this case.
yeah.
So
I mean, I think
yeah,
if we could just pursue this, and then we're going to go into more linguistic bodies
okay.
um, as a side thing, because I'd really like to ask you this question: this notion of like maximum decomposition, let's say. I'll give you a story. So after 15 years, the weasel finally, I don't know how, made his way into my duck house and killed all my ducks except 3 big ones that are a group and 1 little one. And the 1 little one died 2 days later because he was no longer with his his friends. And I knew this was going to happen because once one of those ducks had a broken leg and I put it in a cage to put a cast on its leg, and I had to put him back because he was just going to die. And so in this sense, like the maximum decomposability of that body is
Mm,
like all those ducks. I mean, maybe they could have lost 2 and gone down to 3. There was 5 of them. But so this concept is very interesting to me. Like I heard that the passenger pigeons, once they got down to a certain population level, which was still really high, they couldn't sustain themselves.
mm,
And I think so. Um, and I'll tell you a story, and then the implications are with artificial language modules. We don't have to talk too much about it, but just to
mm,
get your sense of it. So 50 years ago, there was this woman, Vicky Hearn. She wrote a book called Adam's Task. She was a professor of philosophy at Harvard. She was a poet, and she was an animal trainer of scent dogs, dogs that would do search and rescue.
mm,
And she learned that Washoe and the other chimpanzee had learned American Sign Language, and so she was allowed to go study them. And so this, of course, was putting the psychologists into crisis. Like, how could chimps learn language? You know, blah blah blah. And so it's similar to the way we react to large language models. So I wrote this essay, and I'm like, okay, so she goes there, and she's really extremely impressed because she wanted to be skeptical, but Washoe, they're having breakfast and they're saying, oh, I want another banana, or could you cut this up, whatever, I want this one. But the question is this really language, or have they've been trained to do sophisticated steps toward getting what they want? And so she's thinking about this. But the thing that really is great about this, what she wrote, was what really disturbed her was then they went out for a walk. And when you took them out for a walk, you had to have like collars, and you had choke collars, and you had to have cattle prods because they weren't reliable.
mm,
So then she says, well, what is language? Is it, so, is it these representations? Or, and then she's a dog trainer, so she says, I know dogs. You can establish trust, you can establish character, you can lose trust and reestablish. They can't sign language, but she's like, that's what language is. And
absolutely.
she warns about how, and then she talks about, she warns about making this, separating the artificial, the artifice,
Mm,
from the infrastructure, that is actually doing most of the work. And So I think this is important because when LLMs came on, and this was the essay I wrote, because it's like they can't do any of that other stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting question. It reminds me of modularity and putting.
Yes, yes, yes. I love that example, that story, because that is in our book, the fact that we go through all these stages, and as I said, we're not just piling them up, and it's at
Right,
the end you have language. It's because language is gonna end up being the way you can do all of it.
right.
And so I can totally understand that a good part of living together and establishing trust, for instance, with a dog, is very much going through some of these stages, maybe very high up, but perhaps not
Yeah,
to the level of having a
intersubjective
conversation.
bodies for sure.
There are
Yeah,
intersubjective
yeah,
bodies for sure, and there are bodies that have developed a language. We might be stretching the word language a little bit, but not too much. In
shared
the,
history.
it's a shared
Yeah,
history, a shared understanding. And language is always about how we constantly build shared understanding out of the messiness of life, out of things that are always, you know, but potentially creating misunderstandings, potentially, um, and so we are ways we navigate that complexity, which in turn, or in part, is created by language itself. I mean, it becomes complicated because the
yes,
language
yes,
itself creates misunderstandings often. And so we use language and at these different levels of regulations and trying to achieve this attunement or trying to negotiate a shared participatory understanding. So that, to me, there is more language in that human-dog interaction in which there is a shared history and trust than in a very artificial way of which a monkey may have been trained to use symbols.
right.
Not to say that it would be impossible to have real language with with the monkey or with the
Yeah,
chip.
like Gorilla and what's
Exactly,
her name?
exactly. But
Jane
but
Goodall. Yeah, yeah,
what is important is this shared history of understanding, and we may have increasingly more sophisticated forms of agency and co-regulation, eventually understanding that we can engage in dialogues, we can take turns, we can repeat what we said in dialogues or what we acted in dialogues, because it doesn't have to just be spoken utterances, and how these actions invite a form of mutual recognition of like, oh, you are the person I am talking to.
hmm,
You're not just suddenly some stimulus that's coming impinging on
right,
my.
right.
It's a person I'm talking to, and we're sharing the conversation and the history and blah blah blah. All of that is all this complexity will always be part of language. And what we normally think of language, or what linguistics, traditional linguistic studies, is this particularly complex level in which this history, this shared history is manifested. It's the level of spoken utterances or written utterances following certain structures, grammatical structures, lexicons, blah, blah, blah. All of that, yeah, is language, but it's not only that.
Yeah,
It's all everything else that's happening under the surface of that symbolic level. Um, and so that is one of the messages of the book, or the main message of the book, that you have to understand how everything relates. And because often when we break down in our interactions, breaks down, something doesn't work, we often go back to a more embodied level of regulation. uh, I don't know, you can picture a scene of two people having an argument, and they cannot resolve, and they're both very distraught and very, very dismayed about the argument, and they cannot move forward, but they might actually resolve it by maybe holding hands for a minute or something like that.
yeah,
And then it's like, oh, we go back to something else, and the fact that we know that or we think that, you know, that may actually help is because that is part of language. We have it in our bodies and in our history of shared interaction
Right.
as significant. And there is no symbol involved. There is simply a gesture or a movement or an act that is valid because it's part of that complex
Yeah.
stories of forms of regulating and connecting and participating. We can fall back often to other forms.
You regain that attunement you talked
You
about.
regain the attunement in another way. You cannot resolve it at a
Right.
symbolic level. You resolve it at a more embodied level.
Right. And then that gives you it, the hope and the reason and the confidence to continue if you want to resolve, you know, and sometimes you realize that there was nothing really there. It was some kind of disturbance at the lower level.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I have another question to ask you, and that is, isn't part of the precarity of linguistic, so we're talking about virtual kind of, I mean, the thing that it's interesting at languages between people is that you know, when we're in our virtual minds and fantasizing or figuring out, you know, who's going to sit with who at the wedding, I'm virtualizing what's going to happen. Or for plumbers, we're simulating together, oh, let's put this down here, and you know, a New Caledonian crow can simulate steps to, so okay, so when we're in this dialogue with people, one of the precarious things is that people can directly, I can directly simulate something into your mind. You can direct, and so dialogue is kind of like the hybridization of that. And what's kind of precarious is like, I'm becoming a little like you, even if I'm resistant and I'm angry at you. I notice your ingression, that's Whitehead's ingression. I'm becoming a little more like you, even as and you're becoming a little more like me. And this seems to be another kind of precarity.
It is, yes. In fact, I think we briefly mentioned it when we were saying that in our interactions, we are constantly being influenced all the time. It happens at that level of interaction. But in case of language, it's so much more, it's so much stronger. First of all, I'm not inventing the language I'm speaking. This language comes with a history. It's my second language on top of things. There's a history of learning more consciously about it and understanding it. And all of that is because in a way we are constantly you know, finding, incorporating language. We're constantly I want to say, uh, finding nutrition in our linguistic surroundings, often in the way of like an interesting turn of phrase that we want to use, or an interesting, um, you know, an interesting word that we want to use in the next thing we write, and so on. So, in dialogue, we are constantly mimicking each other. We are constantly reflecting utterances. The reflected and a reflected utterances or refracted, depending on, it could be changed. I don't need to often. I can write on the structure of the dialogue very often to form a sentence. Not I don't need to know how the sentence I'm speaking now is going to end at the moment that I started it. So all these abilities have to do with our capabilities of picking up and building on the linguistic dynamics that surround us and in which we are immersed. And often this is, you know, like you ask me a question, and the way I answer the question often just has some reflection on the syntax that you're using for your question, or the words that you're using for your question. And so that in a way we are constantly, you know, building language together. And this is a whole different way of looking at language from the way in which I am the single agent here that I need to understand and become competent in my language, or in a second language or whatever. Because what I'm competent as a speaker of a language, my competence is in knowing how to do things with others. That's what I, being more or less skillful at
Yeah,
connecting to the stream of language that surrounds me. So yeah, that is a danger, as you just pointed out, because I may be constantly be changed by that.
yeah. But then you say, you have that great line at the beginning of Linguistic Bodies. The paradox is we make ourselves out of others. And when we look at that at the organic body level, okay, we understand that's precarious. We're going to die, or we're going to rot or something, or get sick. But it seems to me when people try to look at that and seriously at the language level, this is much more threatening to people. And I think this is could be just a psychological symptom of modernity. Because, for example, I'm noticing, I started noticing while you were sharing that um, uh, when you said something about my semantics changes, I was noticing that the sweetness and the way you respond was in me, like, oh, I should be a little more like that. I was receiving it as beautiful and kind, and that little, oh, maybe I could be a little more like that, is the way I might become a little more like that. And my point is like, I think fundamentally, language, I don't think could have taken over the human experience if that was our first experience with language. I think fundamentally, the first experience must have been like my ducks. My duck died because they aren't around. But today it's kind of, we're so threatened by that aspect of dialogue, that even people who now are in dialogue, they make it sound nice, like, oh, then we come to a higher agreement. No, you just become more like each other. You know, see the
Yeah,
difference? This is unacceptable. This is too scary. No, we synthesize and we come to a higher intellectual agreement. Well, now neither of us had to become more like the other.
that's true. And it may be that higher level agreement may be a bit vacuous, a bit like, well, kind of like, but if there isn't, if no transformation is involved, I'm not so sure there is real agreement. I mean, any disagreement can only move towards an agreement if there is some transformation and in all the participants. Um, if there is transformation in only one of the participants, there's not quite an agreement. It's more like assimilating towards what the other
Mhm.
want. But an agreement is like we have to come together and change. So it could be a vacuous agreement to say like, oh, we agree on something when we are not really changing our minds or anything. Um, so all of this is part of experience of language. We are constantly um, picking up and exposing our linguistic agency to the potential transformation that we pick from interactions with others or from observing others. It doesn't have to be merely only an interaction, but it could just, or from reading, because language becomes more complex in
Mhm.
the writing. And so that is a tension in that I may be at risk of not having enough cohesion myself as a linguistic agent. So I'm trying, because all of these other voices are kind of speaking through me, and so that is the tension that we say in the book that we have to always navigate. That we're not, there is no, each of the other tensions, like how do we do the handshake and so on. There are ways in which we can find systematic ways of coping and reaching agreements. But the tension of how we make ourselves as linguistic agents constantly and all the time changing is one that we just simply navigate all the time the best we can. And sometimes you do well, and sometimes you don't do so well. Sometimes, sometimes you're because you can't just simply say, "Oh, I'm gonna always be speak like I want and the way I do things the way I want, and nobody will change me," because essentially you're just not becoming a participant.
Right.
You're removing yourself from the possibilities of participation. But
Right.
if you participate, like the duck that needs to participate and it
Yes.
needs that connection, um, you risk changing. I
Yeah.
mean, I say risk as if it was a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but you may actually feel at that moment that is something perhaps you're not so sure about.
Yeah.
Uh, so yeah, that is then we call it the tension between incorporating
Oh, yes.
utterances and incarnating forms of linguistic agencies. There are two words that refer to embodiment, but they have subtle different meaning. One is like you make something your own, and the other is more like you yourself give body to something else.
Yes.
Uh, and we're always navigating that tension in our linguistic interactions.
And somehow that's similar to the individuating from the background and the precariousness of it, or
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
intersubjective coordination. Am I just going to go do it myself? Or, and there's always this dance. It reminds me of Lex Friedman just did a podcast with Zelensky. Did you see that?
I don't think I did. No.
And they spend the first half hour talking about whether they're going to speak Russian, English, or Ukrainian, because
Okay.
Zelensky refuses to speak Russian unless they need a clarification. So this is very, again, I don't want to be that person. That,
Exactly.
yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes, yes. And you see all this, you know, how important it is for communities what they want to their language to continue when the language is
Mm-hmm.
at risk of disappearing or is spoken by a very minority of elderly people and so on, and they want to rescue that language and how important that is. Because what you're doing is to keep alive keep a way of life of living, in the world. Otherwise, it would just disappear. It's not just that you keep in a lexicon or a grammar. It's actually a way of existing that would disappear with the language.
And the human system needs that kind of diversity, an ecology of
Yes,
that.
yes, absolutely, because there are so many different ways of existing, so many different viable ways of living, um, which is also eventually the work that we do in the book. We start looking at the implications, and we end up discussing a little bit about the ethical implications. But the ethical implications is that in this diversity that we constantly navigating and reshaping ourselves all the time, you should expect that difference is the norm, so to speak. There always going to be difference. There always be, rather than thinking that we must be uniform. Or how you know, we have to accept the fact that difference is always prevalently there
Right.
as part of the kind of creatures that we are. Uh, some differences are going to be super well clearly manifested, like two very different languages, two very different cultures. But within a culture, there will be differences too. Within a family, there will be difference, and that informs, if you like, a more ethical dimension of the work, which is that we have to accept both difference and participation. We have to accept the possibilities that the other is not going to be like me and not necessarily agree. Uh, but not because of difference should I stop the attempt to participate and connect. I know that that's difficult sometimes, especially when there are very polarized ways of thinking or acting. But I mean, there's no other way to
Yeah.
really move forward. You
It's
have to try.
it's an interesting predicament, right? Because part of us knows that there's some experience I've had that nobody will ever really be able to sit in my seat. Many of it is shared almost fully, and we want to really make other people or have other people reflect back to us all our experience. But what we don't want is that to be a two-way street, because in order for me to do that, I also then have to learn more about you, because I can't get you, I can't make you understand unless it's a two-way street, you know?
Yeah.
And so there's always this enriching, you know, of our wants and needs become more rich maybe than we bargained for. But if you concentrate on the richness of it, yeah,
You
that,
may lose something too. I mean, you may feel that you're risking something of yourself if you are too open to change and accepting. That is the predicament. That is the difficulty. But that doesn't mean that this is a problem that we are never able to solve. Sometimes we just move forward and we know maybe we risk
yeah,
change. We didn't like it. We could probably reflect on it, come back, say, no, I have to find a new course. And essentially what I want to say is that it's a way of living, if you like, constantly becoming yourself as an individual. It's an adventure of some kind.
yeah,
That's how I would put it. It's an adventure, and adventures, sometimes things don't go well, sometimes there are setbacks, but sometimes you find the course again. So one
yeah,
has to be have hope always that you probably will work things out. But as I was saying earlier, if you were to just shield yourself against any change, you will never really understand the other. You may understand some surface aspects, but essentially what you're doing is just fitting what you see into the molds that you already have set beforehand. I say, well, this person is like this, is like that. I just put them into a mold there and make them fit. And what if the other person doesn't fit in any of your
yeah,
categories and so on? And so that is the thing. And sometimes you need to be open to change in order to keep on learning.
yeah. You suffer your own isolation then, so you can't get out of the formula for life. You know, Michael
Yeah.
Levin says when things are always changing, and so if you don't change, you die. But if you change, you die. Like your
I
yeah,
get it. Yeah,
yeah.
that's nicely put.
Okay, I have one last set of questions, or one last topic, which is kind of off topic. I mean, it's not, it's, so it has to do with Simondon's work, which I have to say, I've have both of his major works, and I've skimmed through them, and they, for a long time ago, and they deserve a lot more attention. But so you start with organic bodies, and you have this basic template that Simondon uses. I mean, you incorporate him very well in terms of the precarity and individuation. So do you ever see in your work the possibility that it actually rests on a, you know, so you start at the organic body, but rests on a metaphysics of pre-organic? Like, do you ever realize like how, because Simondon, he's saying this happens at like the atomic level. I mean, it's a
Yeah,
metaphysical
yeah.
theory for him. Do you ever like get into that
Oh, yeah.
abstract like space? I mean, that's where I geek out on your work too. So
That's super interesting. Well, I'm more and more uh, curious or trying to understand these more metaphysical aspects that have to do with well, philosophies of nature, especially process philosophy or relational metaphysics that I think are implied in many of the things we've been talking about. I mean, we started with the organic body, but then what happens? What is this materiality? What is this physical world that is able to be so creative when we actually look at it, as opposed to when we actually try to abstract it into a mathematical theory.
Right.
And so an interesting thing, many of the ideas that we've been discussing are we're starting to have some dialogues with philosophers of physics or physicists themselves about, um, if you like, a participatory metaphysics. Like we are always participating, and this is when we measure in an experiment something, we are creating something is being created at that moment, not something necessarily novel and something that nobody expects, but actually an actuality is being created there in the fact that we are now something has changed in the course of time by our action. And so, yeah, I tend, I wrote a paper recently. The title is Facts, but with a slash between the F and the acts, because facts are acts, but they're also facts. I want to say that's not just simply something I fancy inventing and so on.
Right.
I cannot just invent reality, but that reality includes us as as cognizers, as people, with minds, with actions, with desires. So we are all constantly part of that reality. And so, yeah, and Simondon has been very helpful in many of these, in this trying to understand the broader metaphysics, because he has this, what you might call ontogenetic metaphysics more than ontological. It's all about how things become what they are.
Right.
He speaks about individuation, but then he knows that in order to have individuation, you have to have a pre-individual, something that is not realized in terms of its potentialities yet, but it's still something that is there, concrete, as real. And sometimes a trigger comes and the process starts taking shape and taking form. And so there's no such a strong division between form and matter, or form and process, from that philosophy and from Simondon's
Right.
perspective. And I think it's quite appealing to me. But it's also a learning process for me. I want to say that I'm not expert in process philosophy.
Yeah.
I'm learning and learning, and I find it fascinating. But yeah, I think in answer to the question, it is entailed in many of the things I've said, that one probably has to look at this philosophy of nature where we are in constant becoming. Nature is always creating something, and we are part of it. We are participating in it. And that, not for a moment, um, prevents us from being rigorous and scientific and any of that. There's nothing like that. But if we don't acknowledge it, we just simply want to miss always a part of the picture. And that's the kind of things where things are moving towards at the moment for me.
Yeah.
Understand that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we're at a period in history where, the physicists realize they need new imaginative structures to ask new questions, see the universe from totally different perspectives. And they are acknowledging that that like biological science is at home with the kind of nuanced complexity that is probably needed to have a more accurate understanding of cosmogenesis, let's say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. I've seen that, and I've talked to physicists and other people, philosophers who are showing that from physics, they're moving in that direction. They're moving
Right.
towards that.
Yeah, and let's just stop the bleed from biologists moving in that direction.
Yeah,
Okay, we did
totally.
our part,
Or
right?
psychologists.
The biologists did their part. They moved now. Now it's their turn to come
Yeah.
over. Yeah.
That happens a lot. Yes.
Is there anything you'd like to say to young people who are interested in this field, and where you feel that it might have the capacity to make a positive difference in the kinds of things that we're all worried about in
Yeah.
today?
Well, obviously, I mean, there are many things one can say, but to me, the most, I mean, I don't know if it's the most, but a very important thing comes with a certain, adopting a certain attitude of curiosity, always try to understand what's happening, but also an attitude of like, I am not just an observer, I'm part of it. So it's difficult sometimes to understand when you're part of it, but with that, I want to say that you matter. I mean, you're not just outside. Sometimes the discourse that we receive is that, oh, what can I do about that problem? Seems so big that I, as an individual, can do nothing. Well, that's part of the what we normally accept, but it's not so much that you as an individual will change the world, but the fact that if we all of us start knowing that we are participants in the world, we probably will start getting a different perspective, or start realizing when the opportunities come for to make a difference, recognizing those opportunities more easily and say like, ah, I maybe could go this direction because it will
Mhm.
help with this concern that I have. So often that you ask at the beginning, what is the practical implication of having this alternative view of life and mind and language, is that the message that at the end of it is that you're part of the world, and yes, you may not have the power to actually reshape the world, but it may be that you do have some power, some possibilities, especially if you do it together with others, and you accept the fact that in doing so, you're also going to be changed. Uh,
Right.
and sometimes that change, you may like it, you may not like it, you may want to change it again, and so on. It's a process. It's nothing is so definitive that you say like, oh, this is a dead end and I'm stuck now. It may be that a process has to emerge from there anew, in a new way.
Yeah. And we might as well welcome it because we have no choice, especially if it's a metaphysical property of the
Yeah, we
universe.
have no choice.
Yeah.
Exactly. Change is there always. Um, but something I like, and one idea that I think deserves to be more understood, and is the idea of hope. The idea that how terrible things are, what can we do about them, and so on and so forth, is hopeless. Well, you may be absolutely right about all the statements of fact, but to be hopeful is not about a statement of fact. It's about what remains. You know, if there's life there and you're still there, do you want this life to start maybe creating something different? You have to start with something, and I always think that the first step is hope, and it's not just a one person hope.
Right.
It's something that just percolates, and my hope is something, is a value, and in the sense that we evaluate somebody's actions or discourse as that gives me hope, and in that sense, I think it's important to understand hope, not just simply as optimism, not just simply as saying, oh, things will eventually get better and therefore I disengage from things because I expect them to get better. No, no. It's about like uh, hope as a mover for action, for saying, well, maybe I want to do this small thing, or maybe I want to join this group of people who are doing interesting stuff and be part of that community. And that implies that there is hope involved. Um, and to understand hope, I think is an interesting question. I don't think I understand it fully. Uh,
Yes. But
but
you
but
trust it fully. I can tell. I do too.
you can trust it. Yeah. But I think it would be a really interesting thing to say whether all these things we've been talking about all these theories and so on, could it bring us closer to understanding what happens when we are hopeful? That would be interesting, the direction to go.